Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wisconsin Rural Economics Summit. My name is Brandon Hofstede, and I am the Community Economic Development Program Manager with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. And it's my pleasure to open this summit and to welcome hundreds of fellow participants from over 110 different Wisconsin communities from across the state. Today's summit is focused on rural Wisconsin and is meant to examine Wisconsin's diverse rural places. The wide array of rural communities creates many often divergent economic development challenges requiring innovative strategies. So our goal for today is to examine rural Wisconsin, its diversity, and to be forward-looking and focus on innovative strategies and opportunities that foster economic well-being for our rural communities. We are excited that you are able to join us for this conversation. And before we begin, I'd like to briefly thank our event sponsors. First, the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and our co-sponsors, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, Wisconsin Rural Partners, and the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And a special thank you to the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Today's meeting was made possible in part by a grant from the US EDA in support of the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm sure that we're all professionals at this point when it comes to having online meetings. But just to go over a few housekeeping items, as a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphone when you are not speaking. Also, you're welcome to ask questions of our presenters. You can either use, just because we're going to have so many people joining today, you can either use the raise hand function, which you can find at the participant next to your name, or you can actually utilize the chat at the bottom of the screen. And we'll have a couple of people on our team that will be monitoring the chat function and will respond appropriately. If you don't feel comfortable asking or sending something via chat, you can also send a private message to myself or my colleague, Kristen Runge. She should be at the top of your list, and her last name is Runge. Finally, we will not be taking any official break. It is a 3-hour summit, but we will have transitions between our presenters. So please feel free to use that time in between as you see fit. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Steve Deller. Steve is a professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and community economic development specialist with Extension. Steve's work focuses on modeling community and small regional economies to better understand the changing dynamics of the economy, assess the impacts of those changes, and identify local economic strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And today, Steve will discuss general historic economic trends in rural Wisconsin. So with that, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. What I would like to do is kind of give a broad overview of the rural Wisconsin economy, kind of a 30,000-foot level, if you will. As the session goes on, as the summit goes on, we'll dig down into some of the specific areas a little bit deeper. But one of the things that I would like to point out, first of all, is that I'm giving a long-term perspective here. To think about where the economy is going, we need to kind of have an understanding of how we got here, where we are today, to give a feel for what we're thinking of going into the future. The 800-pound gorilla that's sitting in the room is COVID-19. I am not going to discuss that. Tessa Conroy is going to be talking about that a little bit later in the summit. Now, when we talk about rural Wisconsin, we have to kind of come up with a working definition of what we mean by rural. And oftentimes it's in the eye of the beholder. What I'm going to be working with is non-metropolitan as the kind of the classification. Non-metropolitan counties are counties that are not classified as metropolitan. So it's kind of the leftover, if you will. Now, a metropolitan statistical area is one that is at the county level. So we're talking about counties. And it has the equivalent of one urbanized area, one city or village, or maybe twin cities, if you will, that has a population of 50,000 people or more. Plus adjacent territories that have a high degree of social and economic integration of the core, measured by commuting ties. Now, I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, because I think that this kind of points to how we can kind of paint different pictures of rural Wisconsin depending on how we want to define rural Wisconsin. Now, 50,000 as a threshold for population, that's been around for years and years and years. Just recently, within the last month, there's been a proposal to change that from 50,000 to 100,000. Now, we can talk about the pros and cons of that, but the point here is that this kind of seems somewhat arbitrary in terms of what we're defining as rural and urban. But for purposes of moving forward, I'm going to be working with non-metropolitan counties. These are all the non-metropolitan counties in Wisconsin as of 2010. Most of those kind of make sense. The kind of the southeastern part of the state, Green Bay, Stevens Point, Eau Claire, kind of you can see the influence of the Twin Cities coming in over the river. But look at Dane County below. Look specifically at, now Dane County makes sense. You've got Madison as a metro area, but look at Iowa County to the immediate west and Columbia County to the north and Greene County to the south. Okay, if you're familiar with those particular counties, you would think that Iowa County is a pretty rural county. So is Greene County. It's a pretty rural county. But it's part of the Madison-Dane County metropolitan area because of the commuting patterns. There's a lot of people that live in these counties that commute into Dane County for employment. By definition, that makes Iowa County, Columbia County, and Greene County metropolitan counties. Okay, now these commuting patterns, Matt Kears will be talking about this later on, about how when we think about rural areas, we kind of have to think about it within a larger regional context. So one, we have a, kind of one way to think about it. There's another way to think about rural is not at the county level, but really more at place level. The census has a second definition of rural and urban, where they define any place, and this would be a city, a village, or a town that has a population of more than 2,500 people. That would be classified as urban. If it's less than 2,500 people, then it would be classified as rural. So you get a little bit of a different picture here. You actually get, if you put the two maps side by side, there's a lot of overlap there, but you actually start to see finer layers of detail here in terms of what is rural and what is urban. Now, Rochelle Winkler, when she talks about migration patterns, she's going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So we have this one question of what do we mean? And I'm just going to say with the non-metropolitan to move forward. Now, one of the simplest measures to look at is what's happening to population. This is the population growth index that goes all the way back to 1969 and it goes up to 2019. Here, what I've got is a growth index for all the metropolitan counties for the US and Wisconsin, and all the non-metropolitan counties for the US and Wisconsin. So the non-metropolitan Wisconsin is that heavy badger red line. Now, a couple of things here. One is, notice that there are periods of population growth for rural areas, but then there are two periods where it really kind of it bottomed out. There was no population growth occurring. And that was for Wisconsin, rural Wisconsin, that was in the 1980s. And those of you that have long enough memories, that was not a good time for the Wisconsin economy. Then there was recovery. And then the Great Recession came in and we haven't really recovered from the Great Recession. But notice two things here. Notice that rural Wisconsin, up until we hit the Great Recession, was tracking along urban or metropolitan Wisconsin. Rural Wisconsin was doing actually fairly well up until the Great Recession hit, and then things changed. Also notice that rural Wisconsin tracks the US non-metropolitan population growth fairly well. Now, Rochelle's going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So I want to move on and talk about things like income and employment. Now, what this is I'm looking at per capita income and I'm comparing it to the US national average. So if the county's per capita income is above the US average, then the index would be above 1. And if it's below 1. So essentially, rural Wisconsin's per capita income is that, again, that badger red, heavy red line. It's been averaging around 80 to 85% of the national average. Now, a couple of things here is, again, you can kind of see these periods of decline. You can also see periods of growth. The farm crisis of the early 1980s, the Great Recession kicks in, and you can see that Wisconsin rural areas is kind of lagging behind in these last few years. But notice that rural Wisconsin is consistently doing better or higher per capita income than the rest of rural US. Okay, metropolitan Wisconsin kind of bounces above the average, it drops below the average a little bit. But rural Wisconsin here is kind of like, well, compared to the national average, we're not doing too bad, but we could be doing better. Okay, now there's different ways of measuring um, income. One way is to think in terms of poverty rates. Now, what this is the individual poverty rate for Wisconsin counties. And you can see here, the darker the blue, the darker the shade of blue, the higher the poverty rate. And you can see some of the non-metropolitan counties starting to pop out a little bit. But there are some non-metropolitan counties, Door County, for example, that actually has fairly low poverty rates. On average, the typical non-metropolitan county in Wisconsin had a poverty rate of about just over 12%. But for metro areas, it was just over 9%. So the poverty rate is a little bit higher in rural Wisconsin than it is in urban Wisconsin. Now, if you look at let me just, I got to move something here so I can see a little bit better. Thank you. Another way to look at this is eligibility for SNAP program. SNAP program is the old food stamp program. It's food assistance program. Okay, it's another way of kind of measuring poverty rate. You see the same kind of pattern here as you do with the poverty rate. And again, the number of households or the share of households that are eligible for SNAP programs in rural Wisconsin is about 11.6%, whereas for metro Wisconsin, it's just over 9%. So again, both of these measures are saying that income is lower in rural Wisconsin. The child poverty rate. This is where we tend to kind of focus on, are these children that are kind of starting off kind of um, kind of 1 foot in the hole here because they're starting off in poverty. You can see here that the poverty rate for children under 18 and under, or under the age of 18, is higher in non-metropolitan areas. Indeed, if you look at the scaling over here, you can actually see that there's one county in Wisconsin where the child poverty rate is 53.6%. It means over half of the population, the children in that county, is in poverty. And you can see which county that is that jumps out. If you look at the elderly, and again, I should say older, not elderly. Elderly is generally held for those that are 85 and over, is the older poverty rate. Those are that are 65 and over. Again, you see the same kind of general pattern, but the poverty rates tends to be lower for people that are 65 and over. And again, you can see the metro is 8.5%. Non-metro is 8.5%, metro's about 7%. So again, the poverty rate is a little bit higher for rural Wisconsin. Another way is looking at number of high income households. For this, we're using a $200,000 cutoff. And you can see that generally there's more or a higher percentage of households, high income households in metro compared to non-metro. You can also see some counties that are popping out. Some of the suburbs of Milwaukee are popping out. Kind of the areas that are being affected by the Twin Cities are popping out. Dean County pops out. But you also see a couple of counties in the northern part of the state that are have fairly low levels of high income households. If you flip it and you look at the very lowest income, those are households with less than $100,000. Non-metro, again, is higher than metro. But also notice how Milwaukee pops out here. Milwaukee actually pops out as having a fair number. But again, the scaling is, we don't have that many that are really very, very poor, less than 100,000, but those that do tend to be in Milwaukee or in that northern band of Wisconsin. Okay, now where do people get their income? A lot of folks think that the primary source of income is related to work. That would be either wages and salaries or proprietor's income. That would be self-employment. Now, if you look back in 1969, if you add wages and salaries and proprietor income together, you're upwards of about 70% of income is coming from work. But if you look at that today, it drops down to about 50%. What's happening is that we're seeing a growth in personal and current transfers receipts, that kind of orange line there. What that is, a large part of that is Social Security payments. Okay, we're becoming increasingly dependent on Social Security for income. That's partial reflection of our age profile. More people are eligible for Social Security as they get older. But now this has a real ramification for a lot of rural communities in Wisconsin and indeed across the US, is that as these rural communities become more dependent upon Social Security as a source of income, the viability of the Social Security program becomes more and more important. Now, if you look at the number of households, the percent of households that have Social Security income, non-metropolitan counties, almost 40% have some Social Security income compared to metropolitan counties, which is 31, 32%. Also notice the band across the northern part of the state, much higher percentages. Okay, part of that is retirement migration in these northern areas, but these areas are increasingly dependent. But if you look at the number of households that have retirement income, notice that the percentages drop significantly. Okay, we went from almost 40% to 23% for non-metropolitan. What that means is that there's a lot of folks that are receiving Social Security benefits that are not of retirement age. These could be disability benefits. These could also be dependent children. For example, if a parent dies, one of the programs, Social Security programs, is that the child is eligible for Social Security benefits. So it's not just retirement that's driving the Social Security um, high levels of dependency on Social Security. But again, look at the northern part of the state where there's a lot of dependency on retirement income. And that seems to make sense given a lot of the retirement that's going on in the northern part of the state. Now let's look at employment. Okay, you can see the various recessions and whatnot, but notice the one thing I'd like to point out on this one is notice how non-metropolitan Wisconsin is tracking metro Wisconsin almost exactly all the way up until the Great Recession. Then you see a divergence. Non-metropolitan Wisconsin has not recovered from the Great Recession to the same extent that metropolitan Wisconsin has. So employment, while we're not growing as fast in terms of population, in terms of employment, rural Wisconsin seems to be doing okay. We can talk about the pay scale that's associated with those jobs. From an employment perspective, up until the Great Recession, rural Wisconsin was actually doing fairly well. But it's that recovery period. We haven't caught back up to where we were post the Great Recession. Okay. Now look at some of the changes in this is non-metropolitan Wisconsin employment growth by different industries. Okay. Not surprisingly, farm employment is slowly trending downward. This is not surprising. If we look at manufacturing, which is the blue line there, notice that there was some growth up until 2000, then it kind of dropped down. There isn't a whole lot of growth in manufacturing. There's some trend upwards, but look at what's happening in finance, insurance, and real estate. Okay. The point here is that a lot of the job growth that is occurring in the economy today is not associated with the traditional economic backbone of rural Wisconsin. The traditional backbone was agriculture and manufacturing. Those sectors for employment are not growing at the same pace as other types of sectors, particularly the goods producing sectors. I think we can see that a little bit when we look at the dependency on goods producing employment. That would be farming, forestry, mining, manufacturing, construction, compared to the service producing sector, finance, insurance, healthcare, retail, the government sectors in there. But you can actually see here that there are certain parts of Wisconsin that are more dependent. Now, if you get in the very northern part of the state, a lot of that's tourism dependent, a lot of that's recreation dependent. So there's a bit of a shift there. Okay. Now, labor force participation rates, notice that the labor force participation rates are highest in the southeastern part of the state, the southern part of the state. And that this is larger a reflection of the demographics, the age demographics. The lower unemployment or the lower labor force participation rate in the northern part of the state is really more a reflection of retirement patterns um, than simply people sitting on the sidelines waiting for work. That's generally not the case. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think is really important here is if we look at where job growth is coming from. This is US non-metropolitan job growth. Okay. Um, the Wisconsin pattern looks very, very similar, but I want to go with the US here because the data's, we have a little bit more faith in the data here. Now, job growth can come from two places. One is new businesses, startups. The other is existing businesses adding jobs. If you look historically, existing businesses tend to add more jobs than new business startups. The problem with this graphic, though, is that existing businesses are also laying off people. They're contracting, they're shutting down, they're laying off people. So what we want to do is we want to look at the net. Okay. So if we look at net job growth, notice that that kind of grayish line, that's existing businesses. Existing businesses tend to be laying off more people than they're hiring. And this is not a recent phenomenon. This has been occurring for decades now. All the net job growth, new net job growth is coming from business startups, entrepreneurship. This chart kind of tells you why small business development, new business formation is vital to the vibrancy of the local economy because existing businesses tend to be laying off more people than they're hiring. Okay. Now look at Wisconsin non-metropolitan employment growth. This is proprietor employment growth. Okay. Proprietor employment growth is kind of the self-employed. This is a very simple measure of kind of small businesses, if you will. Look at wage and salary growth. That's the dark blue line. And you can see it's kind of up and kind of the Great Recession hitting in. You can see Wisconsin's proprietor employment growth is fairly flat. There was some growth in the 1990s through the 2000s, but since the Great Recession, it's flat. But look at US proprietor employment growth. Okay, tremendous growth there. One of the things that's holding back Wisconsin's economy, both urban and rural Wisconsin, is the rate of small business startups. Okay, this is something that we need to I think we need to focus on a little bit more is helping those new businesses foster and start up. Now, a couple of things that move beyond jobs, a couple of issues that we're seeing a lot within our extension programming in terms of issues that rural communities are struggling with. One is housing. Housing, a lot of communities are struggling with housing in two regards. One is the housing is too expensive or the housing is not of very good quality. So what we want to do is look at kind of the housing stress. One of the thresholds that is generally used in the real estate market is if if more than 35% of your income is going towards housing, you're kind of viewed as being stressed, financially stressed when it comes to housing. You don't want to spend more than 30%, 35% of your income to housing. Okay. But if we look at Wisconsin, those people that own their house and have a mortgage, in metro areas, 15% are mortgage stressed or housing stressed. They're spending more than 35%. In non-metro areas, that is actually, it's higher. It's almost 20%. Okay, so in rural areas, particularly look at the northern part of the state, again, you'll see that there's a higher share of people that are experiencing housing stress. Now, rental stress. What about people that are in the rental market? Much, much higher levels of stress when you're in the rental market. Now, there's not as clean a pattern here between urban and rural. Indeed, you actually see in metro areas, 32% of people that are in the rental market are stressed, whereas 31% So this rental market problem is not just a rural issue, it's a Wisconsin-wide issue. So I think that when we think about housing, we need to think about the affordability, not just of owner occupied, but the rental market as well. Okay.
5 minutes,
Broadband.
Steve. And we had a question earlier. I'm sorry, 5 minutes. We had a
Okay.
question earlier about what year the data is from the ACS, and if this is
Oh,
ACS data.
this is 2019 5-year averages. The data just came out, I want to say about a month ago. So this is a 5-year average from the 2019 ACS. All the trend data, that is current from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Thank you.
Thanks. 5 minutes, and I'll give you the next warning earlier.
Okay, thank you. Broadband. Tessa Conroy led a team of us that put together a broadband report. And one of the things that we're finding is that broadband is there's a bit of a digital divide here. This is, again, from the census. This is people reporting whether or not they have broadband of any type. You can see that it's not just a rural issue, it's also an urban issue. And a lot of that urban issue is related to the cost of a subscription to broadband. So it's not just access, it's a cost issue as well. Indeed, if you look at kind of the traditional wires coming into your house, fiber, cable, DSL, there's a bit of a bigger disconnect there. But you do see that in the more urban areas, Green Bay pops out, southeastern Wisconsin pops out, you have higher concentrations of people that actually have that hard wire. So that's a supply issue. The broadband of any type is not only a supply issue, it's also a cost issue. This is something that the state is going to be spending a lot of time worrying about. Okay, so questions. How do we define rural? It's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Rochelle Winkler is going to be talking about this a little bit more. Population growth has stagnated in rural Wisconsin. We have not come back from the Great Recession. Historically, employment growth tracks rural employment growth in Wisconsin tracks urban employment growth, except post the Great Recession. We have not recovered. We're greater dependency on goods producing sectors. Is that limiting future potential growth? We have higher rates of poverty, greater dependency on non-work related sources of income. New and small, most new businesses tend to be small. We're lagging behind. Wisconsin has, in terms of national rankings, has generally not done very well in terms of levels of entrepreneurship. I think we need to refocus on that. There is housing stress. There is a broadband disconnect, but it's not just the infrastructure, it's cost. There is a renewed focus on rural Wisconsin. The WDC has embraced rural Wisconsin as a focal point. The governor's office has embraced rural Wisconsin as something that needs greater attention. The other thing that I'm really kind of enthusiastic about is that there's a lot of rural development institutions at the local levels that are really showing some levels of energy. And I think that's encouraging. I think a lot of rural Wisconsin communities have kind of said we need to pick up the ball and run with it, because we can't wait for Washington D.C. to do anything. The state can help us, but we need to pick up the ball and run with it. And I'm really encouraged by the level of energy that's occurring in rural areas. And I will stop there and see if there's any questions or comments.
Great. And thank you, Steve. We do, have like 1 minute. So if people have a quick question, Rochelle, if you want to queue up your presentation.
Steve?
Yes.
Got a question for you. The rural population is 31%, is 14%, urban is 31%, and suburban communities represent 55% of the population. Why don't we have data on suburban areas? Why is there focus not in suburban areas?
Because suburban areas are really part of the metro. And this is where you kind of get into the discussion of, is Iowa County really, for example, a suburban area of Dane County? According to the census and those commuting patterns, it is. So it's one of kind of getting into definitional issues of how we want to do this. I think from a rural development perspective, I think this is all kind of information that we need to kind of keep in the back of our mind. And I think when we start looking at Matt Kier's kind of commuting patterns, I think it's going to kind of jump out and jump home. So again, I think that Rochelle is going to be able to give us a little bit more insight in terms of some of these urban rural differences.
Great.
Thank you.
So thanks again, Steve.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Dr. Rochelle Winkler. Dr. Winkler is a professor of sociology and demography at Michigan Tech University in the UP. Rochelle's work focuses on spatial inequality, including patterns of residential segregation and distribution of social and environmental resources. Her primary topic of study is on rural communities, especially relationships between community development, internal migration, and resource distribution. And today, Dr. Winkler will be discussing migration patterns in rural Wisconsin. Rochelle?
Thank you. And thanks everyone for inviting me to be here today. I join you from Michigan Tech University in Houghton, Michigan, which for those of you who don't know is located in the western upper peninsula of Michigan, near the shores of Lake Superior, about 2 hours north of Eagle River, or about 6 hours north of Madison. So that means the nearest metropolitan area to where I live is Green Bay, followed by Wausau. And I love Wisconsin. I worked as a demographer in the Applied Population Laboratory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 7 years prior to moving north. And Wisconsin still feels like home to me. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to be virtually, at least, with Wisconsin people today. So when we think about migration patterns in rural Wisconsin, or rural America more generally, this is the general pattern of what we've seen over the last several decades. I want to take a minute to explain this chart here at the beginning, because I'll be showing several similar ones today. So what you're seeing is net migration, which is the number of in-migrants minus the number of out-migrants by age over 6 decades of time from the 1950s through 2010. So the chart shows median rates of net migration for the non-metropolitan counties across the US. So like Steve, in this chart and in most of what I'm going to show today, I'm focusing on the non-metropolitan counties as a definition of rural. So the zero line is a bit darker than the other horizontal lines, and it's important because that's how you know whether there's net in migration, everything above zero, or net out migration, everything below zero at that age group. So you have the youngest ages at the left and the oldest ages at the right. And it's showing rates per 100 people, meaning that the number of net migrants is divided by the population at that age group. Both domestic and international migrants are included, and each color represents a different decade. So the light green line for the 1950s, dipping down to around -45 for ages 20 to 24, means that in 1960, the population at ages 20 to 24 in the average non-metro county was about 45% lower than it otherwise would have been, and that was because of out-migration in the prior decade. So we see here that over the last several decades, non-metropolitan America has seen continued net out-migration of young adults. That's the general pattern, though it varies somewhat from decade to decade. The 1950s and the 1960s saw the greatest losses across age groups. Agriculture was consolidating and the United States was rapidly urbanizing with the post-war boom economies at that time. The 1970s was different. It's known as the non-metropolitan turnaround decade, where more rural areas attracted net in-migration at most ages, and they lost fewer young adults than they had been in the years prior. The 1980s, again, as Steve talked about, brought the farm crisis and renewed out-migration away from rural America. The 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s were better, but still not quite as good as the 1970s. The new thing really in the 1990s and the 2000s was an increase in families, kind of that age between 30 and 49, we'll say, with children also. And so the youngest ages kind of coupled with that. So we saw an increase in those families returning to rural roots, or people who may have left rural areas when they were in their late teens and 20s, but returned when they were in their 30s or 40s, often with children. And the other new thing in recent decade is the rise of retirement migration to rural America. So this is a big story, and you've probably heard it before. 6 decades of this sort of pattern is what has led to an aging rural America, and that's one that's generally losing services. It's a cycle where outmigration, economic stagnation, and kind of a lack of innovation feed into one another. My plan for today is to disrupt this story somewhat, to pick it apart into different types of rural places, and to show how this is playing out in Wisconsin, to reflect on outmigration of young adults, what that really means, and to bring it a little bit more into the future. So if we look specifically here at Wisconsin counties in the decade between 2000 and 2010, the metropolitan counties are shown in a solid blue line and the non-metro in dashed red. Similar to the national pattern, we see the average non-metro Wisconsin county lost young adults, but gained families with children and retirees. But one of the points that I want to make is that not all of non-metro counties or rural places are the same. Even within Wisconsin, there's a great deal of variation. So in a recent research project, we took all the non-metro counties in the United States, and based on their age-specific patterns of net migration, we used some statistical classifying techniques to group them into 5 different types that are each quite distinct. And the map here shows Wisconsin counties by their type. The counties shown in gray are metropolitan and are not classified here. But the types we came up with are destination counties. Those are the first type, we'll call them. These are shown in a darker gold color. And these are what we might think of as the most successful non-metropolitan counties in terms of attracting in-migrants. So destination counties tend to attract migrants at both those family ages, 30 to 49 and children, and retirement ages, especially 55 to 74. They also don't lose many or might even gain a few young adults in kind of the 25 to 29 range. Retirement counties are more common in Wisconsin. These are shown in light yellow, and retirement counties tend to attract family and retirement age migrants, similar to the destination counties, but they lose more young adults. And they lose, in fact, a similar number as what I'll discuss in a minute as the rural exodus counties that are losing a lot of young adults. University counties are those where migration patterns are seriously impacted by the presence of a university. These are shown in blue here. And that means they attract large numbers of what we call emerging adults in their late teens and early 20s. But those same people mostly tend to leave after graduation. The youth migration and rural exodus counties follow that sort of common story that we've heard for decades a little more closely. And these are the 2 most common types nationally. The youth migration counties are shown in light green here, and they see a moderate loss of young adults due to net migration. They lost an average of 19% of 20 to 25-year-olds between 2000 and 2010. And they tend to see modest gains of migrants at family and retirement ages. They also tend to be adjacent to metropolitan areas. And then finally, those rural exodus counties are shown in dark green here. These are similar to the youth migration, but they lose more young adults due to net migration. So they're losing in the neighborhood of around 37% on average, 25 to 29-year-olds. And these tend to be a little more remote from metropolitan areas, as we can see here on the map. So from these patterns, we can see that there's a good deal of variation in age-specific migration, even within Wisconsin, and that these differences have important implications for economic development. If we look comparing to the nationwide study that we did here, Wisconsin has disproportionately more retirement counties and university counties and fewer youth migration and destination counties than we would expect nationwide. And this is another representation of those 5 different non-metro migration types. So you're seeing the average net migration rate by type of non-metro counties across the United States here. The university counties stand out as gaining those emerging adults, and then they leave after graduation. All the other types lose young adults on average, but to very different extents. With the exodus counties in that dark green losing the most young adults, retirement counties are losing almost as many. The youth migration counties lose fewer, and then the destination counties are losing the least. So the destination and retirement counties stand out for gaining retirees and family ages. And I want to just give a couple of examples here of how these types of counties play out in Wisconsin. So for destination counties, we could look at Sauk and Trempealeau counties. Retirement counties, a couple examples are Vilas and Vernon, and then some other examples there in Southwest Wisconsin. I wanted to take just a minute and look at this website, which is a website that some of you might be familiar with. It's one that a team and I created to showcase these kinds of data. You can visit the website, it's open to the public, and make your own maps and charts and kind of explore as we go along. So I wanted to just show you, we'll start by zooming to Wisconsin here and zoom in. This is showing again those net migration rates. The purple counties are ones that are growing due to net migration, the orange ones that are losing. And we can play around with this and explore changes over time or how things vary by age. So if we look at those 25 to 29-year-olds, you can see that the most of Wisconsin is losing the 25 to 29-year-olds, except for the more urban areas where they tend to be moving to. Sauk County kind of stands out as a non-metro county that was gaining at this age. But then when we look at, say, those family ages again, we see quite a different pattern. We see a lot of non-metro Wisconsin and more rural areas gaining family age. And then especially if we look at retirement migration, we see a lot of rural Wisconsin gaining retirees and some of the more metro areas losing.
Rochelle, we're at 4 minutes.
Thank you. And then if we look at those examples again, I want to show you by charts here. So I'm just going to make a couple maps again, showing a couple of our examples. We'll look at Sauk County and we'll also then look at Trempealeau. Well, I'm going to Trempealeau County. Both of these were destination counties. And then let's compare those also to one of those rural exodus counties, again in Southwest Wisconsin, Crawford County. So you should see this chart sticking up now. So you see Sauk and Trempealeau were both kind of gaining a lot of family age, also some retirement age, losing fewer in the young adult frame, versus Crawford County, which is losing a lot more young adults, gaining fewer in that retirement age. And Monroe County would be another example of one of those what we call youth migration counties. So I just changed Monroe County is now in the middle there. And you can see that pattern of how they're all kind of attracting the retirement age, but big differences in how many young adults they lose and how many family age we attract. And those kind of differences can make a pretty big difference in where we're going. So to come back, I'll just mention in Trempealeau County, a lot of the reason there, we can also break this down by race and ethnicity. And a lot of the reason that Trempealeau County is showing up as a destination county is because of Hispanic immigration. And to bring this a little bit more recently, these are just some early estimates for the 2010 to 2020 period. The greens here are looking at positive net in-migration, where the reds looking at net out-migration. I'll just caution you that these data are pretty early because we don't yet have the results of 2010. And one of the other things with this period 2010 to 2020, as Steve mentioned, we have the economic recession really coming into play here. In that first part of the decade, migration really stagnated really everywhere across the US, and we didn't start to see migration to pick up again until later in the decade, after about 2014 or 2015. So counties that had been losing people in the early 2000s actually lost less and did a little better than we might have expected, but counties that had been gaining people didn't gain them like they had been. And so this is just another chart that kind of looks at that kind of breakdown over time within the 2010 to 2019 era. And this specifically just shows those manufacturing counties in Wisconsin. And you can see they were losing in the first part of the decade, but started to gain near the end of the decade. Similar thing in the recreation county. These are a lot of those northern counties that had been growing due to migration prior to this most recent decade, but lost some or didn't gain very much in the beginning part of the decade. We started to see that rebound at the end of the decade. And then there's COVID, of course, which throws everything into a whirl. There's some indications that COVID will create or is creating some kind of shift more toward rural Wisconsin, rural America. We really don't know how much of that is going on because the good data are really just not here yet. And we don't know how much of it will just be a seasonal or a temporary thing, or how much of it really could lead toward long-term change. And I think those are interesting places going. So to kind of conclude here, historically and still in rural places, we see outmigration of young people, especially in those emerging adult ages of the late teens and early 20s. But this, I would argue, is not something to worry too much about. It's probably a good thing. People leave and get a good education and some life experience. The bigger issues are where rural places could make a difference are with younger adults who are a little bit older, like age 25 to 29, and especially with those family age people. These folks have skills and resources, but they need services. People at these ages have already been inclined to move toward rural places, but they'll need services like schools to be able to do that. Retirees are also mobile and tend to seek rural destinations. So attracting retirees is a realistic strategy, but I caution you not to focus too much on retirees to the detriment of younger people who offer that needed workforce. We did see those retirement counties tend to be losing a lot of young adults. And so it's important in an economy based on retirement migration to not forget about those younger people as well. So I'll leave it at that because my time is up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rochelle. And we'll continue to move along. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And again, we'll try to respond. And Dr. Winkler, if you see some that you can respond to, that would be much appreciated.
Sure, thanks.
So up next is Matt Curis. Matt is a community development specialist with the University of Wisconsin, Division of Extension. Matt has extensive experience working with communities and organizations across the state in the areas of regional economic analysis, labor force research, socioeconomic impact analysis, and industry sector competitiveness. And today, Matt will be discussing commuting patterns and labor sheds. Matt?
Great. Thanks very much, Brandon. And looking at the attendee list, I see a lot of familiar virtual faces out there. So I'm glad that you could join us this afternoon. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking with you about commuting patterns. And as Steve said in his introductory presentation, commuting patterns is one of the criteria that is actually used to define metro areas. But I think more importantly, it's a really important indicator of how connected different communities are throughout the state of Wisconsin and really across the United States. So just to think about how we can measure different ways of commuting, this looks at primary jobs or jobs that individuals earn most of their income from. And this is for Adams County, Wisconsin. And if you're not familiar with Adams County, it's somewhat in the center of the state, and it has one of the smaller populations in the state of Wisconsin. And we can think about people that work in Adams County. What's their county of residence, or where do they live? And we can see that of the about 4,200 people that have a primary job in Adams County, only about 47% of them, 46.7% of them also reside in Adams County. What that means is that more than half of Adams County labor force comes from somewhere else. It might come from neighboring counties like Wood County or Sauk County or Juneau County. But as we'll see here in a second, there's often times where people are traveling very large distances to work in a given place. We can also think about those individuals that reside in Adams County. There's 7,300 of them. So there's actually about 3,000 more individuals that are employed than are actually working in Adams County. And again, here we can see kind of the mismatches between where people live versus where they work. Of the individuals that reside in Adams County that have a job, only about 27% of them actually live there, which means that almost 70% of the people that are employed in somewhere that live in Adams County commute elsewhere. And this has all sorts of implications for us from both workforce development and economic development perspective. We can think about workforce development if we're not approaching this from a regional perspective and working with partners across our commuting patterns in our surrounding counties. We're probably missing a lot of the opportunities to help individuals connect with employment or connect with employees. From workforce or from an economic development perspective as well, again, we can think about all the different connections that occur in terms of social capital and in terms of the relationships that individuals have as they work across these different geographies. What does it mean for consumer spending? Are people that are traveling out of your county spending money in the places where they work? Or if you have a lot of people coming into your county from elsewhere, do you have opportunities to capture spending while they're there? What does it mean for perhaps employment and housing mismatches? If we have a lot of people commuting into our county from other places, maybe we don't have the types of housing that we need to maybe have them remain locally. If a lot of people are commuting out of our county to other places, does this mean that we don't have the types of jobs or the wages that people are looking for, even though they're choosing to live in our communities? Or quality life factors. Maybe there's a reason that people really want to stay in our county despite commuting a long distance. So that was just a county by county perspective. We can also think about this on a census tract level, and I think this really depicts the types of relationships we have. So here we have Adams County here in the middle of Wisconsin. These are people that live in Adams County, but this is where they work. Here you can see these very strong ties to all different portions of metro areas across the state of Wisconsin, as well as ties to many non-metro counties or non-metro census tracts, excuse me, as well. So we see strong ties to the Fox Valley. We see strong ties to Milwaukee. We see strong ties to Madison, but we also see strong ties to the surrounding counties that we just talked about in the table before. This is the flip side of this. These are people that work in Adams County. Where do they come from? Well, they may not come from as many places as they are commuting into, but nonetheless, we see some of these strong ties across our surrounding counties and also reverse commuting from metro areas into Adams County as well. Now, if we do this for all non-metro counties in the state of Wisconsin and look at those destinations for non-metro residents that at least have more than one person commuting from a given county, we can see this very strong network of commuting patterns across the entire state of Wisconsin and across the entire upper Midwest as well. Obviously, some ties are stronger than others, but nonetheless, we can see that most counties from a non-metro perspective are very, very tied with one another. If we do it for all commutes, even for those individuals that might only have a pair between one county and another county, just one individual commuting from one place to another, we can even see that these networks are even larger. So we can also think about the shares of individuals that live in a given county, what shares of those individuals commute outside their county of residence. And these are the top 15 in Wisconsin. And what we see here is that among the top 15, 10 of those are non-metro counties. So we can see that Buffalo County, over 75% of the people that live in Buffalo County that have a job somewhere commute outside of Buffalo County. We can see also similarly high shares with Florence County, with Pepin County, with Sherritt County, Adams County, which we just talked about, and many other counties that many of you will recognize in terms of having high outflows from their boundaries to other places. We can also see that this type of flow has increased over time. If we look at the share of people commuting outside their county of residence for all metro counties in the state of Wisconsin compared to all non-metro counties in the state of Wisconsin, we can see that from 2002, it's jumped from 44.3% up to 56.0% in the most recent data we have for 2018. We also see that among metro counties, we see a greater share of individuals that are also leaving their county of residence and also interacting with surrounding counties, but not to the rate that we see with non-metro. If we look at these patterns over time, it's not going to be very surprising given some of the maps that Steve showed you before. That map you see on the left is the share of employed residents commuting outside their county of residence back in 2002. And if we compare that to what happened in 2018, we can see, again, for the most part, every county in the state of Wisconsin had a higher share of residents leaving their county of residence. And importantly, a lot of times people may not fully understand why people are leaving their county residence to work elsewhere, but for many rural counties, it's a very important source of income. This looks at the percentage of non-metro counties in the state of Wisconsin, what percentage of that income was earned on a net basis from people commuting from their county residence to another place. And we can see over time, not surprisingly, given some of those previous charts we just showed, the share of income that's attributed to outside commuters is actually rising over time. It declined a little bit with the start of the Great Recession in 2007, but has started to come back up again. You can also see that we've tracked the the US non-metro counties fairly similarly, but we tend to have a higher dependence on income earned outside the county. So again, why do people do this? There's all sorts of factors why an individual may live in one place and work in another. And oftentimes those are going to be personal preferences, and they may be based on commuting times. Maybe an individual has an opportunity to earn more money by commuting to a different place. Maybe housing costs or housing characteristics are not what they want to be near their place of work. Demographics, oftentimes people want to live near people that are very similar to them in terms of income or other characteristics. Maybe they have kids, quality of life in terms of schools, amenities, and other factors. Trip chaining opportunities in some parts of Wisconsin, and I'm sure throughout other parts of the United States. If you have a dual earner household, perhaps one individual works in one metro area, one individual works in another metro area, and they try and split the difference. So a lot of times though, when people are making these decisions, they can certainly look at available information on quality of school districts or housing prices or so on and so forth. But many times they underweight characteristics such as commuting times and the costs that come with commuting. So do they have time to volunteer in their communities? Does it cost a lot to travel from one place to another based on gas prices? And one of the trends that we're seeing is that there is a growing share of individuals willing to travel very long distances from their place of residence to their place of work. And these are known as long distance commuters. Some people call them stretch commuters, or individuals that travel at least 50 miles from their place of residence to their place of work. And here we see in 2002 by census tract areas that had higher shares versus lower shares of these long distance commuters. And not surprisingly, you'll see in many of the metro areas or areas surrounding metro areas, we have lower shares of individuals that are long distance commuters, and our more rural areas, we see higher shares. If we jump forward to 2018, we can see that these urban-rural differences are even more highlighted. We can see that a growing share of individuals in rural areas are commuting longer distances, and we also see that they become more tightly surrounding the metropolitan areas throughout the upper Midwest. So southeastern Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Minneapolis-St. Paul and the Twin Cities area, Indianapolis, Detroit, and so on and so forth. And one of the items that we—
5 minutes.
Yes, thanks, Kristen. One of the trends that we see perhaps in individuals that are commuting these long distances is that they tend to be higher earning individuals. If we look at the change from 2002 to 2014 in this instance, in terms of individuals that earn more than $33 per month, we can see that they're growing in terms of individuals that commute 50 miles or more and among individuals that commute 50 miles or less. But we also see that on a percentage basis, individuals that are higher earners tend to be growing in terms of long distance commuting at a greater rate than those individuals with shorter commuting distances. We can also see that older individuals tend to be growing at a greater rate for long distance commuting, but again, that's not surprising given the aging that's going on in the upper Midwest. And I think this is probably surprising to a lot of individuals when they see some of this data, but I started researching this information based on a personal story. My uncle worked at the GM plant in Janesville, Wisconsin, and when it shut down in 2010, he was given the option to either take an early buyout on his pension or to get into a truck with several of his coworkers and travel to Fort Wayne, Indiana to keep working to his full retirement benefits. So we did that every single week for a number of years until he was able to fully retire. And I think with a lot of the changes that are going on in the upper Midwest economy, you're probably seeing more and more individuals that are starting to do this. And one of the reasons that they're doing this is because they have an opportunity to travel to earn a higher wage than they would locally. So what this chart looks at is what's known as an average wage index of difference. And it looks at the index of difference compared to the share of county residents that would be considered long distance commuters. So if you have the same wage in your county, then the county you commute to, your wage index of difference would be 1. So you'd be right here. So we see honestly a very small share of individuals that commute long distances that would earn less on a county by county comparison. But if we look at the values above 1, so they're commuting into counties that have higher wages than their home county, we can see that as the index grows, the share of individuals with long distance commuters in a given county grows as well. So it's not surprising that individuals will be commuting for a higher wage for longer distances. Now, with this data, we know that with some of these longer distance commuters, as well as with short distance commuters, not all these individuals are making these trips every single day, or they may not be physically making them as well. They may be working from home, they may be telecommuting. And with COVID, I think the big question on everybody's mind is, will these trends continue? Or does it provide an opportunity for people to work even farther away from home if they have the ability to do so? Now, what we see in a lot of the places that are long distance or heavy on long distance commuters is that there are also many of the areas that do not have very strong access to broadband. And here we're simply using 2 different measures to look at the shares of households that may or may not have access to the internet or to broadband. There's a lot of nuances in these maps, but nonetheless, we see that a lot of areas that do have a high share of long distance commuters also do not have very strong internet access. So where this goes forward in the future, I think is going to be a challenge for many communities, but it might also provide some opportunities for communities as well, particularly those that have good broadband access. So with that, my contact information is here. I know we saw in the chat box before people asking whether or not the PowerPoints would be available, and they will be sent out to everyone that attended. So with that, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Matt. And again, if you, there are a couple of questions that if you can answer them, responding in chat, that would be awesome. So next up, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tessa Conroy. Tessa is an economic development specialist with Extension and an assistant professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tessa studies community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurship. And today, Dr. Conroy will discuss COVID and the Wisconsin economy.
Thanks, Brandon. So today, thinking more about COVID, several of our presenters have alluded to it, and we'll finally spend some time. In this presentation, I want to take a quick look. We only have a few minutes together, but take a quick look at the impacts of COVID from different perspectives. So look at how things changed by sector, how things changed by place, think about how things changed by wage, and then also think about equity a little bit in terms of potential race impacts, race and ethnicity, as well as by, again, the wage earning status. So here we go. So first, we'll just look at employment in Wisconsin, and I'm taking sort of a longer term perspective here just so that we can benchmark. So this is a growth index for metro and non-metro Wisconsin. I'm sticking with the definitions that we saw earlier today. And you see some fluctuations over the season, so the seasonality there in the data. But I want to first look at the general trends. So that's the 2 dotted lines. So going back just to the Great Recession, so on the far left, we see this dip, of course, in employment, and then a recovery, and a quite robust recovery, particularly in metropolitan Wisconsin. However, what you see for non-metro Wisconsin is a slower recovery. In fact, we were just getting back to sort of pre-Great Recession employment levels when the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic hit, and you see this big drop, particularly in April. Luckily, a lot of employment came back fairly quickly, but some of that jobs recovery has started to slow down. And when I look at this sort of long-term trend coming out of the Great Recession, you see this widening gap between the employment prospects in metro and non-metro Wisconsin. And when we think about the pandemic, we see non-metro drop lower than metro Wisconsin. We see that it hasn't recovered quite as well. So I think there's potential to think about perhaps a continuation of that trend where we see gaps widening even more. I'm hopeful of some opportunities for rural Wisconsin, so maybe we won't see that, but just something to think about in terms of the immediate impacts in the context of longer term change. So the employment impacts also varied by place. So here we're looking at the non-metro counties in Wisconsin. I'm showing you the percent change in employment from February. So I'm sort of benchmarking against the last normal month and how that compared to April of 2020. And when I look at this map, I see sort of general increases in the change of employment as we go north. So larger losses generally in the north, and then pockets of high losses also in our counties where we have a lot of tourism, for example. I see overlap with our counties that have gaming, for example. So as the economy contracted with some of our safer at home orders, restrictions and mandates on travel, as people stayed home due to fear of exposure, we saw that some of those counties that have these industries most impacted certainly had a lot of the largest losses in terms of employment. We're also seeing the labor force change, and to some extent, I expect to see what I'm seeing in this graph. So again, using a growth index, so that just means we're sort of benchmarking against the first month of January 2019 and looking at how things change from there. And you see this sort of slight increase in the labor force in Metro Wisconsin and a slight decrease. And to some extent, I expect that. We talked about how in rural Wisconsin, we have a slightly older demographic, perhaps larger shares of people with physical disabilities, and these things, these structural aspects can all feed into differences in the labor force. What's striking to me about this graph is the sort of acceleration of the difference in the most recent months. Hard to say perhaps what exactly is going on there yet, but I think a couple things come to mind. One of them being that as we see people sort of enter into long-term unemployment, perhaps they come discouraged and then just leave the labor force altogether. Benefits run out, job prospects aren't looking great. So perhaps that those people leave the labor force entirely. I think we're also looking at a time where COVID cases in rural Wisconsin are starting to rise. So even if people feel, or even if there are jobs, if people feel it's not safe to return to work, that might be part of what's going on here. I also show this slide just because I want to keep in mind that when we look at the unemployment rate, or you see the unemployment rate in the news, perhaps the unemployment rate is coming down in a given month, and we just want to think about, well, is that because people are actually getting jobs and getting back to work? So we're seeing the numerator change, or is it because people are leaving the labor force and they've become discouraged, in which case the denominator is changing? And I think that can kind of hide what is not always an entirely positive picture. So just being aware of what's changing when we look at those employment outcomes. So now looking at things by sector. So these are the sectors with the most job loss in Wisconsin. I just grabbed sort of the highest, or the sectors with the most job loss. And the clear disadvantages for accommodation and food services. We see losing close to 120,000 jobs, and that's in April. So the red bars are job loss as of April compared to February. And then the orange bars are June compared to February. So we can kind of see the changes over time and how quickly some jobs did come back. What's interesting about accommodation and food services is that it's the largest level of job loss as of April when we look at the red bar, but it's also one of the larger shares of jobs. So it's a lot of job loss, but it's also almost 50% of the sector. When we look at retail, trade, manufacturing, healthcare, and social assistance, these are also sectors that lost a lot of employment, but much smaller compared to the overall size of the sector. When we get to arts, entertainment, and recreation, there, the level of job loss is smaller than some of our other sectors, but it's still huge compared to the size of the sector. Again, more than half of jobs lost as of April. And I think you can see the variety of perhaps the types of jobs that were impacted as well. Accommodation and food services, people stopped traveling. Retail trade, people not shopping as much. Manufacturing certainly impacted. Healthcare and social assistance, this is where we're seeing childcare providers, for example, would be in this sector. Other services, that's where we would see some of the personal services such as barbers and hairstylists. So across the gamut, you can think of examples in each sector of workers who were really heavily impacted. Because accommodation and food services was the sector with the largest loss, I wanted to give us a sense of where in Wisconsin are those pockets that may have been hit hardest in terms of losses from the pandemic. And here I see the largest losses in a lot of our tourism counties. So those counties that have a lot of employment in accommodation and food services are the same ones we saw a few slides ago when we were looking at the change in the employment level. So Walworth, we have places like Lake Geneva, Door County, places close to the Dells, Bayfield. These communities that have a pretty robust tourism industry are also places that had a lot of losses, unsurprisingly. Here what I'm showing, this is from tracktherecovery.org. And if you haven't visited this website, I highly recommend it. There's just a lot of cool information and great graphics. We're looking at the percent change in all consumer spending for Wisconsin. But I wanted to show you this to look at the consumer side of the trends we just observed. And what you see here, I need to rearrange quickly. What you see here is how consumer spending has declined in entertainment and recreation, in restaurants and hotels. So consumer spending in those categories fell dramatically. And those are, of course, the same sectors where we saw a lot of the employment losses. So consumer behavior here on one side and thinking about what that meant for workers on the other side. Grocery spending, interestingly, of course, went up. So we saw lots of people suddenly planning to stay at home, whether that's, buying toilet paper and some other essentials, but we do see this spike in grocery shopping as people plan to be at home more. They're not going out to eat and things of that nature. Regardless of, when we think about consumer spending, one of the things that's interesting about consumer spending is thinking about, well, what's driving that? Is it the case that people are staying home because there's a mandate or a restriction or a safer at home order that's keeping them from going out and doing their shopping or eating out, these sorts of things? Or is it a fear driven? Is it sort of a personal preference where fear of exposure to the virus is actually what's keeping them home, which is the binding constraint? And there's a new study from MBER, it's a very reputable group, and they're looking at border communities. So places where on one side, consumers didn't face a restriction, and on the other side, consumers did face some sort of mandate or safer at home. And then they look at, well, how did consumer behavior change? And here's an example of where they find relatively small differences. And what that means and what the results of their paper show is that actually the mandates weren't the major factor, that it wasn't the most important consideration, that actually consumer confidence, the fear of infection, was the more relevant factor in driving these changes in consumer spending. So I think that has important implications when we think about how we would respond to the virus going forward if we were to consider another safer at home, and what kind of policies might be in place, and how that would relate to consumer preferences and what is actually the binding constraint and shaping economic outcomes.
And Tessa, we're at 5 minutes.
Okay. So people are also spending more time at home, unsurprisingly. So this is percent change in time spent outside of home. So a lot less time at retail restaurants, a lot less time at our place of work. And I think that this points to perhaps the opportunity in some ways for rural communities, that if people are less attached to their place of work, if they are maybe less attached to what we might think of as urban amenities, that maybe they can live wherever they want. And some of them might prefer rural communities. So I think we're starting to see here some of that opportunity take shape. Looking now at the percent change in employment by wages, and we see that the largest changes were for low wage earners. So that's where employment decreased the most, the smallest change for high wage earners. And I want to put this alongside what was happening in the stock market at the same period. So from March onward, we had a pretty robust stock market, a lot of growth. And the people who benefited from this growth in the stock market are also probably the people that suffered relatively low or small employment changes during the pandemic. So perhaps, we were very concerned about inequity in some communities before the pandemic, and that you see the potential to exacerbate those changes even now based on these dynamics. The last thing I'll emphasize is just the change for small businesses. Here, huge declines. As of January, business revenue is still down 30% compared to about a year ago. So significant losses, of course, for businesses, making it difficult to stay in business. And even if you can, perhaps incurring the expense of reconfiguring, cleaning, going touchless. The challenges are, many for our business owners. And in thinking about business owners, I want to highlight in particular the smallest business owners. Steve showed us how job creation really relies on new and small businesses. And business data can be hard to track in real time. I'm using the current population survey month over month, and the sample is pretty small. So I'm showing this with a dotted line to encourage us to think about what's the overall trend here, more so than what any one data point is showing us. And you see this downward trend for Wisconsin. And I think that's part of a longer term trend that Wisconsin, in general, when we look many years, many decades over, entrepreneurship is declining, but you see how the pandemic plays into that as well. And in other parts of the country, when we look at this, there's actually quite a bit of a rebound, but not here in Wisconsin. So some thinking to do in terms of how we might rehabilitate the business community. Using that same data, I want to show the impacts for minority, Hispanic, and foreign-born self-employed people as compared to white, non-Hispanic, and native-born. And again, the sample's getting relatively small, so I'm pooling across states here. So these are states that are part of the Federal Reserve's 9th District, and that's just to get a bigger sample and related to some other work I've done. And I think what you see here is quite a difference in terms of the scope of the impact. So for people of color, foreign-born, we see this pretty deep and persistent negative impact of the pandemic. So starting in April 2020, a big decline compared to February. So again, I'm just benchmarking against February as that last normal month. And then it gets better in the summer and then comes through the fall. Not nearly so severe for white, non-Hispanic, and native-born self-employed. And that's largely due perhaps to the sectors that self-employed people of color work in. What I'm showing here is some of the most vulnerable sectors when it comes to the negative impacts of COVID-19. And what we see is that for white, non-Hispanic business owners, close to 38% are in these vulnerable sectors. And other than American Indians, self-employed people of color are much more concentrated in these sectors that were suffered the largest losses during the pandemic. So that might help us understand the previous slide when we think about those long-lasting and deep negative impacts of COVID. So a couple of takeaways for us today. We've seen through telecommuting and combined with that time spent at home that telecommuting seems to be working for some at least. And could this fuel what I would call a rural renaissance? Proximity to larger cities, higher natural amenities, good quality of life, and access to broadband could all be part of attracting people to rural areas. And I think I want to highlight here the impacts for small businesses that many, if they haven't been already, will be forced to close. And then how can we help businesses rebuild when the pandemic is over? And I expect we'll continue that conversation in the breakouts. So with that, I will thank you for your time today.
Excellent. Thank you, Tessa. And next up is a fellow Cyclone, Dr. Deborah Toodle. Dr. Toodle is a professor of community and regional planning and extension specialist at Iowa State University. Her research and outreach focuses primarily on the role of social infrastructure in rural community engagement, development, and resilience. Over the past few years, Dr. Toodle has worked to address issues relating to community resilience and how rural communities can adapt to shocks caused by natural disasters and socioeconomic downturns. Today, Dr. Toodle will share lessons learned from Iowa. So Dr. Toodle, I'll turn it over to you.
My first question to you all is, can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, good. We don't have to ask anymore if we can hear each other, but it's always, can you see my screen these days? Let me get back here to where I need to be. First of all, I want to thank you all very much for inviting me to talk today. It has been fascinating hearing about what's going on. And as you've just heard, I am going to be talking more about social infrastructure. I am very excited to do this, not only because I am happy to talk about the Iowa Small Towns Project whenever I get a chance, but it's also an opportunity for us to start sharing some information across states and to be looking at some of the similarities that we're seeing, and also to be thinking of maybe not the whole Midwest, but the upper Midwest together and looking at that larger picture. And it's also, like Matt said, nice to be able to look at and see a lot of familiar, friendly faces, virtual faces. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. I'm going to start off by giving you just a little bit of background on the Iowa Small Towns Project. Then I'm going to talk about some of the trends that we've been seeing since 1994 in this particular study. We'll do a deep dive into some of these trends. And then we're going to take that and talk about some implications and some applications for Wisconsin. And what has been really nice about the presentations that we've heard so far is that so much of what you all have been talking about is related to some of the same trends that we're seeing. And I think what I'm doing today is really going to provide a lot of context and sort of the big picture. You're not going to see these small towns, these rural communities from 30,000 feet. It's more like looking at them from 500 feet. So we'll be taking a little bit of a different perspective. I hope by going through this, we help you to start thinking about some of the innovative strategies that Steve Deller talked about in the beginning about where we need to be able to go. And I did not put a lot of numbers in this presentation. I am just showing you some trends in general. But for those of you all who like numbers, I am going to put a link in the chat box so that you have access to all of the reports that we have generated in this project. So let's go ahead and let's start off with a little bit of background. The Iowa Small Towns Project started back in 1994 with a project, a research project at Iowa State University called SIGMA. And we did SIGMA in 1994. In 2004, we repeated SIGMA. We repeated SIGMA again in 2014. And then in 2016, we decided, you know, this is good looking at all this trend information. We're learning a lot about our communities, but we also need to be able to start bringing in some other type of information and bringing in some things that we were not seeing back in 1994. So that's when we started introducing this Iowa Small Towns poll in 2016. So what is SIGMA? SIGMA is a mythical town. You could equate it to like Wobegon, if you like. It can be anywhere in rural Iowa. SIGMA is the community that we created by looking at all of the data and tabulating it and creating this mythical community. And we found by creating SIGMA, it was very easy for people in Iowa to look at their community relative to SIGMA, which is really nothing but the average of what we were seeing across the state. So we have been collecting data on the same 99 Iowa small communities for the past 20 years. What's so important about this data is that, to our knowledge, there is no other study that has looked at community life for such a large number of small towns for over 2 decades. And while 99 communities may not sound like a large number of communities to look at, when you look at it and you think about the fact that we're collecting information from the same communities for that long, that is quite a lot of information. And in our last rendition of the SIGMA study, we had almost 7,000 cases, or almost 7,000 people responding to us in those 99 communities. What we are learning is that we are getting some really unique insights into changes that we're seeing. And this is the context I was telling you about. What is actually going on? And can we start looking at some of this information and trying to figure out, from looking at it very closely, what is going on in our communities. Our next data collection is scheduled for 2024. When we finished the last data collection, we thought that was a really long time, but actually it's not, because now we're not that far away from our fourth data collection. We also, in the summer of 2015, we started adding some case studies, and we started looking with our case studies and looking at some amenities, social capital, social networks in some of our communities. We focused on local leadership in our small towns. We looked at organizational networks, and we really focused in on the quality of life. And most of you have already mentioned the quality of life today in your presentations. So it's really nice to see how all of these presentations are starting to converge. So what are we doing with the Iowa Small Towns poll? I mentioned to you that we just started doing the poll. It is a continuation of Sigma, but it is going to be much more frequent. We are trying to do the poll every few years. And I have to say that COVID kind of threw us off schedule this year, but we are going to continue back with that pretty soon. It's the same 99 counties that we have been looking at. Plus, we added 26 more. We expanded our criteria for including counties. What we have put together is a panel design so that we can not only observe what's going on in the same communities, we're going to be surveying the same respondents every couple of years. And it is a compensated panel. We found it was very easy to get people to participate when we provided the compensation. We are asking in the poll, we are asking some of the similar questions that we had used in the other waves of Sigma, but we have also asked some more topical issues. For example, we started looking at drug use in our rural communities because we didn't have any way of getting that kind of information otherwise. So, why are we focusing on small towns? As you all know, and as you heard today, Iowa is like Wisconsin in that it is a state of small towns. Iowa and Wisconsin counties are predominantly non-metro, and you've already heard, and Steve gave us a really good overview of what non-metro is and the fact that it is a residual category. Most of the research that we see takes place in metro areas. We do not see that much research on what's happening in our non-metro areas. So this is a very important issue for us because our rural, our non-metro economies, our non-metro communities are very important in our states. So when we look at 20 years of data, what we are finding is in Iowa is very similar to what you all have talked about in Wisconsin. Farm economies are changing, mostly declining, but not all. We have to look at it under a lot of different contexts. We're seeing the declining industry. Steve talked about the decline of the goods producing industries. We're seeing population change. You saw a lot about the population change today. And I'm not talking so much about population decline in our rural communities in Iowa, but population change, because yes, we are seeing a lot of population decline, but we're also seeing some population increase. Some of it is related to being adjacent to larger communities and cities, but a lot of it isn't. And that's one of the things that we are trying to really dig down into. And I think some of the things that you heard about migration and quality of life have a lot to offer as we dig into this. We're seeing aging infrastructures. We see that throughout Iowa. We're seeing declining revenues from most sources. We've seen a shrinking labor supply, and we're also dealing with natural and economic shocks. We've had a lot of natural shocks over the past 20 years. Usually when you have a natural shock, whether it's a flood, whether it's an ice storm, whether it's tornado damage, you're also going to see an economic shock. This year, we have seen the pandemic, and that is also one of those shocks that we're going to see that's going to be reverberating, and you've heard a lot about that already too. So let's talk a little bit about the trends that we're seeing. What we have seen over the past 20 years in Sigma is a decline in local church attendance. We're seeing a decline in shopping. You know, on one hand, you might say, well, why is that important? Why is local church attendance important? Why is local shopping important? But these are parameters that tell us a lot about the sense of community. These are stabilizing factors in communities. These have been very important issues. We're seeing less church attendance that may be related to population change. It may also be related to the idea that we're seeing overall across the United States a decline in church attendance. But that has a lot to do with community attachment. We're also seeing more directly a decline in what people think of a sense of community. Do they belong in the community? Is this a community full of people that they can depend on? Do they have a lot of connections and relationships in the communities? Community attachment. Do they want to stay in that community? And we've talked earlier about some of the migration of younger people out. But we also know from these data that we've had a lot of returns to our rural communities. And that has a lot to do with community attachments. People leave, they go to school, they get jobs. When they start raising families, quite frequently they come back, or when they retire. That has a lot to do with community attachment. We're seeing lower civic engagement. That means we're seeing lower numbers of people who are actually getting involved in doing things in the communities. We're seeing less involvement in local organizations. Our local organizations that used to, our civic organizations in particular, that used to mean so much to our communities, have seen significant declines in membership. And interestingly enough, when we have looked at these variables over time, and we've looked at especially at civic engagement and involvement in local organizations, for the first two waves of the Iowa Small Towns Project, we knew that people were no longer involved primarily because they did not have the time to be involved. But what was a little bit shocking in this last iteration is that the number one reason that people gave for not being involved in the community, involved in local organizations, was that no one asked them. And that was just a real eye-opening experience to hear that. So other changes, and these are more encouraging. We're hearing that social ties may be more important to people in these communities than jobs. There are a lot of people that could get better jobs if they left their communities, but they wanted to stay in the communities where their families lived, where they had connections, where they grew up. And so this was a very encouraging finding for us to find out that those social ties were so important to our respondents. Our respondents also told us that the quality of local government services has been increasing in their small towns. And in general, they felt like there was an improvement in the quality of life. So we were excited about that. We also found a lot of changes that we really did not understand very well. a lot of our respondents in these communities really didn't have many strong feelings about local leadership. In the past 2 waves, people were very unhappy about local leadership. And the third wave, people weren't happy about local leadership, but they weren't unhappy about it. People felt like they could still count on each other, but not as much. You still had friends, you still had neighbors, you could go to them if there was a problem, but maybe you wouldn't do that as much. I mean, that tells us a little bit more about some of the social relationships. And an interesting finding, and we really had to dig into this a little bit, was that the most popular meeting places for people in our rural communities were gas station convenience stores. In part, that may reflect the decline of the downtown areas, but we still thought that people would be meeting at churches, meeting at schools. But what we might be seeing is some of that decline of church attendance and attachment to churches. And we also may be seeing the consequences of some of the effects of bringing the schools together. So the consolidation of schools. So we've got some interesting changes going on. And the question for me, and I think the question for you all should we be concerned about this? Are these important? You know, on one hand, rural economies, small town economies, that's important to our state. It's important to people who live there. And what we're seeing when you look at these findings, these are things that affect the quality of life, and not just the quality of life, but also socioeconomic conditions in our rural areas, because we know that the quality of life affects socioeconomic conditions. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So, you know, on one hand, yeah, we should be really concerned, but on the other hand, we can be excited about some of this because we're starting to see that quality of life is improving in our small towns and communities. And what is important to me, the most important part of this, is that we are seeing problems that can be addressed within our communities. So basically, we're seeing that our small towns are facing challenges, but as somebody, and I think it may have been you, Matt, said earlier, where there's challenges, there's some opportunities. So we are seeing opportunities. And what we're learning from Sigma is that what is so important in our local communities is engagement, the role of local government, the role of the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and also service organizations in creating quality of life and well-being. So let's go into that a little more. Let's take a little bit deeper dive. When we're talking about quality of life in rural areas, there are a number of forces that we see across the United States. It's local services, medical services, amenities. Several of you talked about amenities and recreational opportunities, cultural opportunities. We're also seeing some indication of the role of goods producing industries in this data, and we agree with that. But as Steve mentioned earlier, you know, we've had this long dependence on good producing industries, and that may not be something that we're going to see in the future in terms of rural quality of life. So I've put a little red mark by that just to kind of let you know that yeah, we're seeing that, that's important, but we're really not going to focus on that too much at this point, especially because when we think of policies, we really want to be able to think about those things that can happen in the community that the communities have some control over. So when we're talking about the drivers of quality of life in small towns, rural areas across the United States, we know what contributes to the quality of life: increased civic engagement, increased community engagement, increased interaction, higher social capital. you've heard some explanation of what social capital is. That's the social ties, the social relationships, the social networks that people have amongst themselves and organizations. We're also seeing there's a lot in the literature about elderly populations, and the larger the elderly population, the better the quality of life. And there's could be a lot of different reasons for that. We need to dig into that a little further. Again, the idea of the jobs and the goods producing industries, but amenities. Amenities are also going to be very important. So looking at that another way, if you looked at that slide in a picture, this is what you'd see. You know, the quality of life is going to be dependent on community engagement, social capital, elderly populations, amenities, and always in the background, there is the goods producing industries. But we don't know exactly how much, how important that's going to be in the future as we're moving forward. So what we're seeing from the Iowa Small Towns Project is the quality of life is improving in most Iowa small towns. And we're seeing more improvement in those towns that have 1,500 or more people. And by the way, our definition of small communities is are communities of 500 to 10,000 people. What we know from the data is that our communities with higher quality of life tend to have more stable and growing populations. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But what are we seeing in Iowa in the small town poll? Well, we're seeing community engagement declining, and it's declined steadily and significantly over the past 20 years. Social capital is also declining. What we're seeing, though, is the increase in elderly populations, and we're starting to see a real increase in the focus on amenities. We're starting to look at amenities, and people are particularly interested in downtown amenities and natural resource-based amenities. So we're starting to hear from people, and this became very obvious when we went out and did the case studies about how important amenities are for our small towns.
And Deb, at 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, perfect. So what are the implications of this? Not only what are the implications of these findings, but what are some of the applications that we can talk about these findings? Well, what we found is our small towns are facing challenges, but we always have to remember where there are challenges, there are opportunities. And that's very important as we are trying to move forward with our communities. So if we start in trying to build a foundation in community engagement, stronger in community engagement in our small towns, that's going to be the first step that we're involved in terms of the process of turning challenges into opportunities. And I'll explain a little more in this next slide. We know, and we know this from this data, we know it from projects and data and research that people have done all across the United States. More volunteerism, more engagement you have in the community, you have a better quality of life. And then on the other hand, if you start looking at things like better government services, lower crime rates, just living in a place that's much more pleasant to live, that we have more positive economic outcomes. And included in this, the more positive economic outcomes, resilience to shock. And it's going to be very interesting to see as the years go on and we collect more of this data. We are in the process of trying to collect some data on the impacts of COVID. If we start seeing better response to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of sort of reversing some of the community decline we're seeing. So are we going to see those communities with higher quality of life respond more positively and more quickly if there's going to be a quicker rebound from COVID-19? We also know that building social capital among diverse people and groups increases community resilience to shock. And that is something that is starting to come out of the work on natural disasters. And we're going to start building that into our next wave of Sigma so that we can understand that a little bit better. So what is important about building social capital is that you can deliberately build social capital in communities. There are processes for doing that. We know that community engagement helps create interaction between people. It helps create networks. It helps create social capital. It's that old adage of if there's no interaction in your community, if people aren't talking, working together, there's going to be no community action. Without community action, there's not going to be any community improvement. So that is why we say that is the foundation. Once you have that interaction, this increases community capacity to address some of these challenges. By addressing these challenges, we are going to be contributing to civic, social, and economic outcomes. So basically, if you break that down and you look at increasing community capacity to address challenges, we can look at those challenges that we have identified in this research project. And those challenges that we've seen that are standing out most predominantly are civic engagement, civic involvement, community attachment, local patronage. And all of this comes back together. If we can address those challenges, then we can improve civic, social, and economic outcomes in our communities. So the big takeaway from this is that, yes, we are seeing significant challenges, and we should be concerned about these significant challenges. But the best thing about this is that we can address these challenges, and these challenges are things that can be addressed by people in the communities. So on that, I would like to leave you with this saying by Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And our residents of small communities are going to be the people who help change our communities. And I want to thank you all. I'm going to put some stuff in box so that you have access to some of our reports. And I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great, and thank you so much, Deb. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all the presenters up to this point in time. This is incredible. We're 3 minutes off, so nicely done to everyone who stayed on point. So, so now we're at the point. I'm going to actually turn it over to one of our co-sponsors at WEDC, Sam Rickers. Sam, I saw your name. I'm hoping you're hearing me and you're on.
I'm here. Nice to be with you, Brandon.
Excellent. Excellent. And Sam will introduce our next speakers. So Sam, the floor is yours.
Nice to be with everybody today. Before I do, I get this opportunity. Since the beginning of our pandemic response, it's been just incredible how small of a state Wisconsin still is. Probably in just weeks in, I didn't know Steve Deller from Adam, but we were facing incredible new challenges, and just called up Professor Deller, and within a couple of days got a call back and got some help on our strategy and our initial pandemic response. And Tessa Conroy, it's an honor to be here with her, because it was about 4 months ago, after reading her piece in Windicators on the disproportionate impact that COVID's had and is having on our business of color. And it's not only that we can read her work, but she'll say, absolutely, you'd like me to join a conversation with your senior leadership who are administering programs that deal with the pandemic. So it's just really cool and wonderful to be with Extension today, and grateful that we have this in Wisconsin. It was just about a year ago today almost that Governor Evers signed Executive Order 65 that created or directed the establishment of the Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Rural Prosperity. And as part of that, the commission was established, and over this past late summer and early fall, this was pre-pandemic. And so there was a curveball thrown to this commission, but over the late summer and fall, a group of commissioners from all across Wisconsin gathered input from stakeholders all across Wisconsin. We were really lucky to have the benefit of the Aspen Institute's Community Strategies Group to really help guide us. But in crafting this commission, the governor and Secretary Hughes were really thoughtful in thinking, what is a commission that's focused on blue ribbon, that's focused on rural prosperity, what should it look like? And while we have really critical associations and groups and advocates that are critical to our rural communities' prosperity, what the commission is not are representatives from our major associations or lobbying groups that are really important to the process. What they are, as we really envisioned, was how does a small town in Wisconsin come around ideally to solve problems in that small town? Well, you pull together the farmer, and you pull together the banker, and you pull together the housing developer and a teacher from the high school. You might even bring someone, a student in, you bring someone from the hospital, maybe even someone who's a clinical social worker, and you figure problems out. And that's what is reflected in the 12 members of the Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission and what they were able to do over the last several months. So it's my honor to really introduce two of our commissioners who've taken time to be with us today. Tom Landgraf. Tom Landgraf is not only a really valuable voice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison on housing policy and training folks there, but he's also a real estate developer working with communities, working with nonprofits, working with housing developers to really put together really creative ways to provide affordable housing across a bunch of different communities in rural Wisconsin. The other commissioner that I'm proud to recognize is Susan Townsley. Susan Townsley is a clinical social worker. She practices in Viroqua, has been doing so for many years, and just having someone who knows housing in a community and someone who knows mental health in a rural community, it was an important part of our effort. And so what I want to do, having introduced Tom and Susan, is you guys take your turn, but you guys went through this whole process, 3 virtual conversations with commissioners, 45 written public comments, 25 stakeholder meetings, in whatever order you want to go. What was most surprising to you guys?
Well, I'll jump in on that. Something that Deb just talked a lot about in her discussion was social capital. And one of the things that really was impressive to me was the depth and the amount of social capital that the communities and individuals that took time to participate in all of the sessions that Sam just talked about. I mean, I don't know that I heard a single person down on anything or pointing fingers at different government levels or types of programs. They were all extremely upbeat and knew we were facing some challenges before COVID, and now we're facing more challenges. So it was a question of how can we get it done? And that I think is just an unbelievable resource that probably the average Wisconsinite who doesn't travel in rural Wisconsin much doesn't really have a flavor for. And I'm hoping that the work of this commission and the report that has been produced really helps folks get a little bit greater insight into what's happening in rural Wisconsin and what's not.
Yeah, Susan, how about you? What was most surprising to you?
One thing that really stuck out for me was the struggle we are having with childcare in our rural areas. It's something that I understand and see as an issue, but the particular piece of having our public schools pull in 3 and 4-year-olds, which seems like a great solution, that then devastates the childcare centers who cannot staff care for just 0 to 3 due to the staff ratios and that sort of thing. So it was striking to see how when we don't bring everybody to the table and we think we're finding solutions, we actually cause other problems. And I think that's one of the things that was really beautiful about this commission, was bringing such diverse views to the table to make sure that we don't repeat some of those mistakes that have been made in the past.
Is there someone, is there a voice or a perspective from those listening sessions, Susan, that whether it's on childcare or another issue that really hits home when you, because we can hear data, and a lot of the folks presented today really provided some powerful data, but one of the really astounding things was all the people in the engagement and the human voices that came out of that.
Yeah, there's a couple that stick out. There was, it was Dennis Beale from The Power of Perception, who is up in Eau Claire doing what the last speaker was just talking about, really saying, okay, there is an issue with students of color who are not getting the mentorship they need, and I'm going to create a solution to that. And has done just, a deep dive and really beautiful work in youth mentorship. And that piece of listening to voices around the state, really looking at prevention, was really reassuring to me. But most people realize, and we have to keep looking upstream if we're going to make long-term changes.
Yeah. And Tom, anyone stick out of all the people, all of the different breakout sessions that you spoke, all of the different sessions that you met with other groups, that any one person or stories really stick out to you?
Well, interestingly enough, it's the same subject that Susan was just talking about, which was rural childcare. There was a family childcare center. There's 2 different types of childcare. There's up to 8 children that you can care for in your home. And then there are group centers. And in a lot of rural Wisconsin, group centers are just not economically feasible. So family childcare is really the opportunity for there to be some expansion. And Corrine Hendrickson, who runs Corrine's Little Explorers, which is a family childcare center in New Glarus, was one of the speakers. And I talk about childcare, and I have my students in my UW real estate classes factor that in. So I got in touch with Corrine, recorded a video with her that I used last semester in my fall real estate classes. And of all of the guest speakers that I had in, she was the one that shot the lights out, because she has the ability in about 15 minutes of your time to give you everything you wanted to know and more about what is working and what is not working and what the solutions are to family childcare. So I certainly got connected with one dynamite speaker from my UW classes, but she's indicative of the energy that so many people that were in these sessions just exuded just by showing up and talking. It was wonderful to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah, who just presented last, ended with that optimism. There've been some trends and numbers shared, and if folks have been plugged in or clued into rural prosperity matters, those aren't new numbers. But Deborah, you ended with Margaret Mead's quote, which is always inspiring to me. Tom, from the Blue Ribbon Commission listening sessions, what's probably the most encouraging part of it, or what are the parts that you find most encouraging, having been through the last 6 months and produced a pretty powerful report?
Well, I kind of touched on it earlier. What was so encouraging to me is people weren't weren't just throwing up their hands saying, "Oh my gosh, golly, we're in this fix, and somebody better come in here and help us." They clearly had a grip on what was not right, and they had solutions that they were thinking of, and they were very expert in articulating those. And I just, I mean, I like I said, probably 2 or 3 times already, that to me was just something that is remarkable. And we should be fortunate to have that kind of energy in rural Wisconsin leadership.
Yeah. Susan, you're in Viroqua. I'm sure you probably see it. You're encouraged every day, but what do you feel coming out of the first 4 or 5 months of the Blue Ribbon Commission? What's most encouraging to you?
I think that piece of just everybody, all the voices we heard really being ready to participate and find solutions together. I was really grateful to be a part of the meeting with the 7 Generations Intertribal Leadership Council.
Mm-hmm.
And the voice of really speaking that if we all join hands together and remember that we have to hold hands with our most vulnerable citizens, we all benefit. And I think that was echoed throughout the meetings, but voiced really beautifully and strongly in that one.
Yeah, I agree. How about, Brandon, thank you for putting in the chat box just as you just did, a link to the report. It was published toward the end of December. So I encourage folks to look at it, download it, dig into it if you haven't already. Susan, the report presents at the outset 10 recommendations from the commission. And I've talked with a lot of commissioners, and what's interesting from talking to them is that they weren't actually most impressed or excited by the recommendations. It was really hearing kind of the voice of what people said and shared. But if we drill into those 10 recommendations, if you could just take one of them and explain its importance to you.
Yeah. So if you look at recommendation number 9, it says invest in vital ingredients for a better future. And it was important to me that piece have the breadth and depth of understanding that that's not just one piece, that's multiple pieces if we're going to actually get there. And so it lists as the essential components the vital ingredients: affordable, high quality broadband, childcare and housing, physical and mental health care, career pathways, family support, youth mentorship, transportation, food security, renewable energy systems, and education. Again, that idea that if we just pick one piece and silo ourselves in there, we inevitably cause destruction in other places. But if we look across the board at all of the places that are going to support our most vulnerable families, we ultimately raise everybody up together. So I was really excited to see that laid out so in such detail and with such depth.
Yeah, so was I. And I guess what that does is that tracks in large part what WDC, that about at the same time also began to create the Office of Rural Prosperity. It was a project that was in tandem. And last spring, we are 2 months into the pandemic, and WDC is tasked by the legislature to prepare a report on the industries and the pandemic's major industries in Wisconsin, the pandemic's impact on those industries. And the report that came out of that was really a report speaking to kind of a notion of economic well-being, as opposed to just what can we do to get the industries that are critical to Wisconsin's economic well-being, but all of the other component pieces of childcare, sustainability in the environment, housing, all of those are critical pieces. And so interesting how that's dual tracking. Tom, how about you? When you look at, I mean, I know I've heard you speak and watch you engage, but of the 10 recommendations, anyone that you'd want to kind of elaborate here for the audience?
Well, recommendation number 6, which is entitled Unleash the Full Power of Communities to Innovate and Act by Updating State Laws and Restrict Local Agency. So what does that mean? One of the things that became pretty clear from listening to the communities is that there are a lot of state laws that basically set the ceiling for what local governments can do. And what the report basically suggests is we need to change that 180 degrees and set the floor and not restrict the energy and the outside the box thinking and the myriad of things that local governments can come up with. You know, what is the 78% of the state's population lives in 0.5% of our footprint. So you do the math on that, and there's a lot of the rest of the state that isn't you know, it clearly isn't as densely populated, and those small communities are not all the same. And to be able to give them the ability to do what needs to be done in their particular footprint, which is admittedly very small in many cases, just is something that you think of, and you just can't imagine it not happening.
Yeah, yep. That report published in late December, we don't want it to die a similar death of so many other blue ribbon commissions that have been established. The need was called for, and so as we look ahead, the report has been published. We have the opportunity to share the insights of that report for the next month or so with a number of stakeholders. But beyond that, from your perspective, what's the next step? What's the role for this commission? We'll just start with the commission. Susan?
You know, it's certainly my hope. I mean, it's as you said, it's was a beautiful vision of really bringing the banker and somebody involved in housing and the social worker and the teacher and the way you might see it around a table in an actual rural community, to really think together about what are the strategies and how do we actually make some of these really beautiful ideas happen. And so I know from the other commissioners that we're all very dedicated to doing the work. This was a beautiful start in creating a report and establishing the pathway and the ideas, but now the work has to actually happen. And so I'm so grateful that the Office of Rural Prosperity was created so that we have that backbone to then move forward. And it's my great hope that the commissioners will all stay involved. And I think all of us are really committed to doing that.
Yeah. I guess what I hear you saying is that you know, there's value in the listening, the hearing, and what came out of it was, I guess, a map or a roadmap. Not to shirk responsibility, but I'm going to lean on UW Extension to be some partners in doing that and carrying that out and keeping that going. Tom, how about you? What are the next steps?
Well, to pick up on what you had just indicated, Sam, WEDC didn't inherit this report that was done by a consulting firm because someone in some state agency or legislative committee thought it would be a good idea. We've all seen those reports. They kind of are hot stuff for a little while, and then they just drift off into the ether. This was done differently, and I've got enough gray hair to be able to tell you it was a big difference, and that was the governor created in WEDC, the Office of Rural Prosperity. That office is the one that championed this report, guided it, coordinated it, brought in the appropriate outside folks to help get it done in a reasonable time, and is going to be tasked for continuing to keep life in the report. So I fully anticipate that we'll be dealing with various pieces of it going on into the future, which is great because they're, from having been through all of the listening sessions and thinking that, as one of the commissioners, you kind of had a pretty good flavor for what's in the report. Every time I go through it, I find another nugget or two that I missed the previous time. And I mean, it's a report that's going to keep on giving for quite a while. And I'm glad WEDC has made it a priority to create the office so that there's somebody there who's going to continue to keep life, in the document.
Great. I mean, one of the other parts, and maybe this is putting a spot on our organizers here. Tom, what role, after spending the time you've spent, what are the roles of UW Extension?
Well, UW Extension has been around a long time, and when it first got started with the county ag agents and others, I mean, it was the go-to source of information to get intelligence out of the brain trust at the UW-Madison, out in other campuses, out into the community. And over time, it has continued to do that. But Ray Cross, recently retired UW system president, created kind of a university extension on steroids, and it's called the University Alliance. And it takes individual UW classes. My classes have been involved for the last 5 years, and brings students and communities together to let the students help solve some of the community's problems directly. So it's a more of a laser focused use of the university extension's talents. The big university extension is certainly still there, but this smaller subset is something I would encourage all the people listening to get in touch with Gavin Luter, who's the director of the University Alliance. Talk to him, and he can connect you with instructors on the Madison campus and other campuses to get some students working on your particular problem. And I think that's going to be a real long-term benefit of working with the UW Extension.
Great.
Sam?
Yeah.
We're just a few more minutes, so just as an FYI.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brandon. And I guess I'll leave it to you, Susan, whether it's to Extension or your work in Viroqua. What are the next steps beyond just the commission to the rest of the state, WDC, engagement with UW Extension?
Yeah, so if you read the report, I encourage all of you you will see UW Extension written all over it. So I think that is a huge testament to the work UW Extension has done historically in Wisconsin, the diverse groups that look to UW Extension for advice and help, and our belief as the commission and the Office of Rural Prosperity that you really hold both the breadth and depth in leadership that can really help us make a lot of these recommendations come true.
Great. Brandon, I think that's back to you. Tom and Susan, thank you so much for your time. Good to see both of you and everyone else. As other folks have mentioned, lots of familiar names and faces who really leaned into the process throughout the fall. And you have our commitment from WDC that this won't be one of those Blue Ribbon Commissions that dies that lonely death after just producing one report. We're excited for the roadmap that it provides for us.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Susan, and thank you, Tom. So we are at the points in the presentation or the summit where we will have some breakout sessions. And Kristen, are you able to share your screen? And while Kristen is pulling that up, there are 7 different breakout options that you can choose from. And again, in just a moment, you'll be able to see what those are. And for those of you who are, again, Zoom experts or have experience here, you'll see in just a moment, there will be a breakout room option that will pop up at the bottom of your screen, and you can click onto that and it will give you an option to join. As you click onto that, you will actually be put into your breakout room right away. So I'm going to make it so you actually have that ability to join right from the beginning. And there we are. So those are the options that you have available to you. We will have about 45 minutes in these rooms, and each one of these rooms has folks from various communities and various kind of folks that actually are experiencing and have something to say about each one of the topic areas at the top. And so the way that this will work is it'll be about 10 to 15 minutes of a inspirational story or an informational story that each one of these participants will share. And then really what we're hoping for is feedback and input and conversation from the participants. And so I'm going to open up for everyone to actually see the room. And so you should be able to choose, and at the bottom there will be breakout room. It has 4 different squares. If you do not see it, please just hold tight. I will sit back along with my colleague Lori, who will help you get into a room of your choice. So as you find them, please choose the room of your interest. I'll wait just a moment. And for those who are still on and have not joined a room, do you see the breakout option at the bottom? I mean, you can start with, there's a fair number.
I see it, but it's a blank white now.
No.
Okay, Tim, do you know which room you'd like to join?
Yeah, with Tessa, more entrepreneurial community.
Okay, I will assign you there now.
Thank you.
Yeah, Brandon, I can see all the rooms and all the people in the rooms, but I can't, like when I click on one, it doesn't send me anywhere.
Okay.
It just has me stuck. This is Courtney.
Courtney.
Burner.
And Courtney, where would you like to go?
Housing, please.
And Brandon, since I'm screen sharing, I can't see the breakout room, so I will wait to go to mine until.
Okay.
I just see a plain white box. I would like to go to.
Yeah, I'd see.
Entrepreneurial community, please. Karen Nielsen.
I can't see the breakout rooms on my screen.
No, neither can I.
And neither can I. This is Peggy Burke. I would like to go to the entrepreneurial community one.
All right.
This is Deb Toodle. I would like to go to placemaking, please.
And this is Carrie By. I'd like to go to the meeting and supporting childcare needs.
I'm sorry, what was, Deb, can you,
Yes, placemaking.
Where? Placemaking, got it.
Yes. Thank you.
Donna Newworth, I would like to go to placemaking as well.
Rebecca Giroux, housing, please.
Just a minute. Lori, are you able to do this as well? There's a lot of people that are.
Yeah, I can help.
Okay.
I'm reading the chat here.
And Donna, did you say placemaking?
Yes.
And Rebecca?
Housing, please.
You know, Kristen, if you're still on, if you want to stop screen sharing, maybe that would help.
Okay.
Maybe folks can see it that way. I don't know.
Liz Seefeld, you wanted to go.
Okay, and Brandon, I'm going to go to my breakout room if that's all right.
Yep, that sounds great. Liz, I know you had mentioned one. I'm sorry, which one did you want? Liz Seafeld?
Hey, I've been typing housing to both you and to Lori.
Got it.
Yeah,
I got her.
okay.
My apologies for everyone who's on. There's a lot more people who are unable to join than I anticipated.
Yeah.
Vic Grassman, do you have a place you'd like to go? And there's Richard.
Brandon, I'd like to be able to join the child healthcare or childcare meeting, but I'm not able to get in.
Okay, I will send you there now. And that was, he's here.
Kenan Wood.
I sent him.
Got it.
Linda Jorgensen wanting to be in forging partnerships.
Okay.
Kelly Klein and the entrepreneurial.
Okay.
Rebecca, did you get kicked back to us?
Yeah, I lost my audio, so I had to come out and get back in, but I think I can choose a breakout room on my computer now.
Great.
Which room are you going to, Brandon?
I was going to jump into Tessa's room, but I'm going to wait just a moment. Is there anybody else who's on the call? Again, I think we have most everyone, but is there anybody else who is looking to get into a room that would like to have one?
Yeah, hi, this is Monica Jones. Could you put me in the rural housing group?
Yep, we will do that now.
Thank you.
Did you get her, Lori?
I don't see Monica's name on the unassigned list.
I don't see that either. Monica, are you on a phone?
No, I'm on my computer, so let me try to leave and rejoin because I did get kicked out briefly earlier. So.
Okay.
And you were in where, Monica?
I had never been able to join a breakout room. I was just still in the lobby. Okay. So 1 second.
Oh.
And Lori, are you comfortable signing people if I jump into Tessa's room?
Yeah, I think this is a very reasonable amount of people I can take care of.
I was told there would only be about 15 to 20 that would need to have to be assigned. So that was many more than we anticipated. So, all right, Monica.
Okay. I'll let you know when it's 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, sounds great. And what room, Monica, did you say?
The housing.
Got it. All right, send you there now. All right, I am going to join Tessa's room and I will be back.
See you later. Nice.
Darlene has kind of tailored it to now the new business intelligence program. And we've done 9 of them so far. And one's in process right now. With the 8 that we did, 7 of the 8, we concentrated on top line growth, right? And the data that comes out of Mark's group is phenomenal. The biggest challenge we found is, do the businesses have the people in place to be able to use that data? And that's been the biggest challenge is, all right, data's great, and it's phenomenal. Then we have to work with the companies on all right, who do we need to get in place so that you can use this to grow quickly? The problem you've got with entities like us is they don't typically have enough people to do the deep dives with companies, to spend that much time with them. And that's been the biggest setback that I've seen with any of these is the expertise. You need to somehow put that expertise in place to do those deep dives with the companies. But if you do, you can't do very many of them. So I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Dave. You highlighted a number.
Keep everybody educated and up to date. We've got a network of collaborating partners in the area, which has been phenomenal, where they come and actually view and participate with some of the training and get to know our trainees. And then we have mentors, industry and community mentors. So they work they come and see side by side with our trainees to see how they're working, how they're engaging, and can match up personalities, and they can actually find people that they really want to work for their companies. We also, on the sidebar, we have a mentor program where we're linking mentors with these trainees to help them through this process and then beyond for up to a year. Not everybody that starts as a trainee has had maybe a troubled background, and it's been successful to have somebody kind of walk alongside them and stay in touch with them and see how things are going as they learn to navigate full-time employment, money matters, and budgeting, and how do I make this all work for my family. COVID has changed the industry drastically, like it's changed everything. So our training model is a sign of kind of the new normal. We've got technology-based training model. Again, we said it's a 6-week recognized curriculum and an accelerated path offering families sustainable wages and benefits, which is critical. Candidates recognize the urgency to graduate. They're super excited to know that I can get through this in 6 to 8 weeks and I'm going to have a job offer and it's going to be a living wage for me. Also, they have the opportunity to join a union employer who provides ample benefits and defined pension plans, which is not something that you see very often these days. And I'm going to pass it off to Tim DeJock.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim DeJock. I'm the founder of Trained Skills Management, and we are the industry certified training provider for SoftTech. We provide a WIOA credentialed hands-on training. So it would be slide number, keep going, right there. There you go. So we have WIOA credentialed hands-on skills training, and it's based on a 6-week model. We are the innovative alternative to traditional training. We chose heavy equipment operator training as our first platform, first of all, because there's an industry need. Secondly, because there's a renewed focus on infrastructure. We introduced high-tech simulators using both virtual and augmented reality. With that, we can provide a very safe training platform using 3-degree motion bases, which simulate the actual machine response. The simulators also provide instant feedback, and the interactive operator goals are measured with industry benchmarks for comparison. Through repetition, we can correct a bad habit in unsafe operator situations immediately. So we can take a candidate with zero experience and build their confidence with that simulator. It has been documented that 3 days on the simulator equals 1 month in the field. Change the slide there. Results. Our training impacts the industry partners. Our mantra here at SoftTech is always safety first. We create a local skilled employment pool, and we have less time investment for both the trainee and for industry itself. We produce 85% of the industry required skill sets in just 6 weeks, which is amazing. Our employers save money. We create operator proficiency with simulators prior to introducing traditional equipment training on actual CAT equipment. As an example, the president of one of the companies that came to visit us explained that fuel expenses equal the wage expense, which was shocking. And he was very, very excited with our simulators. He said, if we can just save 5% of fuel usage, we can create a huge savings for that owner. That's how we keep building partnerships and collaboration with these guys, industry. We also offer fewer equipment breakdowns, and we can do this by introducing the maintenance records. We train the walk-around process and the correct startup and shutdown procedures on the simulator first prior to getting to the actual machine. And we also introduce the technology through the GPS. GPS technology allows instant operator site plan interaction in real time. Operators today must use and be proficient in technology to succeed. Now it's back to Maureen.
All right, next slide. It's me again, Maureen. So we had talked about, organically growing the workforce. That's what we were talking about, where we're looking for students and future trainees to come from our local area to support that workforce need. In rural America, there's not a lot of high-paying jobs, not a lot of industries. So what we do have really is looking for a lot of help. And you can flip to the next slide for me. Thank you. So again, our training model is scalable and sustainable. And our goal, again, is providing that full-time opportunities. We can't emphasize that enough. These industries are super excited to have a pool of highly trained individuals that fulfill their employment demands. So it's a win-win for everybody. And do you want to change that slide? And Patty, are you on? And can you move, take it from there?
Yes, thank you, Maureen. I'm Patty Schockner. I'm also serve as a volunteer on the board of directors here at SoftTech. What sets us apart from everybody else? We meet the immediate needs of our workforce to have a pool of skilled employees. This is technology-based training, and it is done in an accelerated manner. We train and our local we train to retrain our local workforce. One of the biggest thing is our program provides hope for those who really think that they can't succeed in the local community. We offer a hand up, it's not a handout. And it is an opportunity for anybody looking for a second chance. Choices and obstacles of the past is not a problem for us. We will work with all people to help them make better choices and have an improved life and hope for the future. Next slide. Women, not a problem. We train anybody, and women do wonderful in this field. Even though it's big equipment, women are very adaptable to this, and we have had quite a few successful women candidates come through our program. Next slide. As you can see, the starting wage is really good wage for rural Wisconsin, and for our folks that graduate with the credentials, they are on that path to growing hope. One of our graduates actually told me that she never thought in a million years that she would have these type of opportunities. And for us here at SoftTech, we could not be prouder of that alone. Next slide. And we are inclusive. Age does not matter, gender does not matter, it just does not matter to us. If you have the drive, we have the innovative, inclusive, and impactful program for you with proven results of success, as seen by the folks that we work with and our graduates. Next slide.
Well, thank you, Patty, for your jumping in there. That's great. And for being a board member. We're honored to have you on our board. In just 6 weeks, our training can really provide an opportunity for a candidate. Our graduates become a high value commodity. Union sponsorships through our partners provides the opportunity to become a union apprentice after just 6 weeks. A sponsored employee starts with union wages, expansive healthcare packages, and a union pension, building a future on the first day. Next slide, please. And we welcome industry participation into our classroom. We started pretty much in the second week when everybody's gets settled into the program and has a little time on the simulator. It's very, very technical and hard to do. So we bring the industry on the second week, as our doors are always open. From the second week forward, our employers join candidates to introduce their company, their expectations, and the opportunity for employment in the future. Our diverse spectrum of industry leaders meets with candidates multiple times and watch their progress through graduation. Next slide, please. We build confidence. When we build confidence, we build drive in each trainee. That's I think the most important thing. Like I said, 3 days on the simulator equals a month in the field, and it's proven as far as with each successful graduate, we impact 10 to 15 extended family members with the positive output of that one graduate. Here you see on the left, Jake Schroeder is our production manager for Meyer Contracting, and he's sitting there explaining, discussing site plans with trainees. And on the right-hand side, we brought in Mark Connie, the vice president of the company. We usually have the president all the way down, the whole team. They come with 5 or 6 people. And it's multiple companies do this throughout our 6-week training. So he's explaining the importance of site assessment and safety trench boxes. And you can go to the next one. So we bring everybody together through this opportunity, right through graduation. This is graduation with Nick Milroy and Doug Neeson there. And the opportunity for industry is to meet their potential candidates locally. They want to catch them before they leave high school or leave the area. They want to grab them now. And it's also an opportunity for the candidates to network directly with the industry. Our process creates, we kind of create a process that's like, it resembles the NFL combine, so to speak. Employers meet candidates in their comfort zone in the classroom prior to graduation. Next slide. You want to go with this one? Okay, I'll go with this one. We've got a partnership this year with North Central Technical College. We're honored to have them on board. Sorry, I have to move around a little bit. I wasn't ready for this one, but we have, as you can see, our letter of commitment there from Mr. Brad Gast. He's the Dean of Workforce Training. With our program, we wanted to have extended classwork beyond our 6 weeks for our students. And what they're offering us that works really well with our program is leadership pathways, project management, and construction management. So we're very proud to have them on their online classes, and most they're rated number 2 in the nation for Brad, and we're excited to have them with us. And here we got Marina, who's the last one, I guess. Oh, no, we're going to talk about our SoftTech model. Next slide, please. The little building in the front is what we actually have today is this our small 1,500 square foot building. This model is scalable, as Marina had said earlier. This can go anywhere in the state. We feel it's a very, very good program. So the idea of it is basically a three-door model where we have the education center attached to a hands-on technology-based skills training center, and then attached to a business incubator, working side by side with industry mentors, community mentors, and get everybody involved to build that confidence to go out and get a job. We've had real good interest in this. But we do feel that this can go anywhere in the state. It doesn't have to be brand new brick and mortar. It can go into some building that's existing today in your neighborhood, basically. And we'll bring it back to Maureen.
All right, the next slide. I did want to just mention that not everybody that jumps into this training program is a student or newly out of high school. We do have people that, as well, one of the slides was older. Some have a varied path that maybe isn't very desirable for some employers, but as long as they've got a driver's license, they can pass a drug test. What's my other list?
18 years old.
18 years old.
Lift 50 pounds.
Lift 50 pounds.
And they have to have a valid driver's license and a source of transportation.
There we go. So, I mean, that might sound like a lot for somebody that's trying to start over again, but if they have those pieces together, they can be looked at for the training program and give them a second start. So, and then I guess, Tim, do you have other comments or do we wrap it up?
I guess we had a couple, Sam, we had a couple questions on the chat box, cost of the training. Pre-COVID, our training program basically ran $8,500 per student for that 6-week period. Now, post-COVID, with COVID in place, it's actually jumped up to $13,500 roughly. And because we had to do 2 students in the morning, 2 students in the afternoon, and then we had to double up on our instructors to split everybody up. We used to be able to do group sessions, which will now become Zoom sessions, and we touch base with them. In that cost, we also included the classwork either for project management or construction management, and also including the leadership classes through North Central Technical College out of Wausau. And we had a question that as far as the capacity to connect a student for the job, that's where I think our program really differs and sets itself apart, is by bringing industry right into the program, and industry gets to meet prospective employees right from day one, after that 2nd week. And we do have job fairs at the end. We help them with interviewing. We have a very solid board, as you've met a few of them. They help with interviewing processes and mentors and mentorship. So we can answer the other questions in the other section there, Sam.
Tim, I just have a question for you. I mean, what WEC has been hearing about even since the start of COVID is that the clamor from Wisconsin construction and business and manufacturers in need of skilled work hasn't gone away, despite the fact that our unemployment rate and idle workforce has really gone up dramatically. And so something like this just makes a ton of sense. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you guys were one of our award winners in our recent contest. But can you kind of walk through a little bit more of what you're doing to market this to businesses, and maybe some examples of relationships you started with industry who are, is it starting to catch?
Sure that, but I don't know that that's going to be anywhere in the federal approval process for budgets for a long time. And it's going to take a lot of advocacy. Small steps, again, if you can just help bridge some of those gaps in purchasing in bulk, helping them make some better income, that helps a little bit. It's not the answer. I think the bigger answer is that we have to advocate and start paying them what they're worth. They're required to have an education, 2-year degree, and $8,000 is not very much money for someone with a 2-year degree.
So, oh, go ahead, Esther. Were you going to say something else?
Oh, just thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the question. So I think we only have a couple more minutes left. Brandon, correct me if I'm wrong. And I was looking at the clock at the top, so I was fooling us thinking we had more time. But I guess I wanted to ask, and Kara, if you're still in a place that you can chat, you can chime in here as well, because I know this is the area you're working in. But Michelle, what sort of involvement or relationship building or partnering were you able to do with your local Latinx community, if any?
Current system, yes.
That was not me. So they might be bringing us any moment into the main session. So before we end, or before we get shuffled back into the main session, I do want to put a plug in for the resources we have at the university. I met Tom because I was doing a project on housing in Wanakee, and Tom and Kurt Paulson came in to speak and really transformed the way the community I was working with, which is Wanakee, it's north of Madison, approached housing, completely changed their view on what affordable housing looks like or could be in their community. But part of the process of working with the Extension or University Alliance or one of the other organizations or arms at UW, which is, I'm just scratching the surface in this list, is really focusing on community preparedness for housing. And that involves things like looking at who is in the community, where is in the need, and conducting conversations across the community on how do we align our ideas about housing with the reality of the market that we're facing. If you are interested in those sorts of conversations, that is our, what we do, that is our service to the community through UW Extension Center for Economic Development and the EDA University Center. So please reach out to me. I will type my information and my email in the chat here. I can help you get connected. I am also on the board of University Alliance and can put you in contact with Gavin Luter, who Tom has referenced. They're an excellent organization, and we work with them very strongly in a number of different communities. So please do use this as a resource.
Wonderful. I think everyone is back who joined a breakout room. Sorry to those who had the technical difficulties. I figured it was going too smoothly to not have technical difficulties at some point. So again, thank you for everyone for joining those breakout sessions. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it back over to Sam, who will provide some concluding remarks. So Sam.
Thanks, Brandon. They won't be long, and I kind of peppered them during our conversation about the Blue Ribbon Commission, but with the launch of WDC's Office of Rural Prosperity a year ago, with the Blue Ribbon Commission that really also launched at the same time and just produced this report, it is evident to WDC, I think certainly all parts of the state government, how critical UW Extension is. We've talked about it today, not only just in convening groups like this and really bringing critical data and ideas to fore, but also given the immense power of its staff, its statewide spread, how wonderful it is that this is happening and that they're doing this. WDC and our Office of Rural Prosperity is really just thankful to Extension for putting this on, whether it's from our Blue Ribbon Commission report, the work you've heard. We've had a broadband connectors pilot that the Extension team has been critical to. Just thank you for this work, and thanks for being partners going forward. And thanks to all of you who are here today for spending the last 3 hours with us, and all the contributors kind of opening our minds, drawing some attention to some of our challenges, but going back maybe to some of the takeaways that Susan and Tom shared, just how encouraged folks still are, how inspired folks still are. We just came out of a presentation of Softtech, the new ideas that are coming out of rural communities of where our communities are going. And for Deborah Toodle for quoting Margaret Mead. Those are my highlights for the day. Thanks, everybody.
I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us. I think we had some great conversation and lots of reoccurring themes. As I put in the chat, when you have an economist, a sociologist, and a political scientist, as well as people from the business world, all agreeing on something, you know there's something there. So I just want to thank Deb and Rochelle for coming in from out of state and sharing some of their research ideas with us. If we in Extension can help facilitate or follow up with any ideas, please visit the Center for Community and Economic Development's website. It's still there. We're going through a transition there. I'm not sure exactly when we're going to transition out, but you can find the team, a large part of the team there at that site. So thank you.
And with that, we will conclude, and thank you everyone for sticking with us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Look for a follow-up with additional information with the recording and any handouts that we'll provide. So I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.